Good evening. 晚上好，晚上好。Shall we start? My name is Zhongying from Renmin University, and you have already know from this brush one page introduction, and I'm so glad to be invited and honored to moderate the lecture given by well-noted, internationally recognized authority, Professor Dr. Edwin Winckler, and his Chinese name is Weatherhead, and I found this is in Chinese characters and also in traditional Chinese, and the simplified Chinese without the xin, without the heart, love, but the traditional Chinese character with xin, with the heart. So this is a very interesting name. The middle name, and the last name is De and Winckler. So and Professor Winckler's brief personal history, and you can find from this introductory page, and for saving time, I would not read and leave more time for your speech and your interactions with the audience, including my students and two PhD students from Renmin School of International Studies. And finally, let me briefly introduce me. And I studied at the Nanjing-based Johns Hopkins University at the Nanjing University, Chinese and American Studies Center, and I was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and so I was on the same avenue, so-called the Massachusetts Avenue in Washington D.C. for two times, one time, the other time, two times. So my United States knowledge limited, but your China knowledge not limited. And we are so glad to share your views, your thoughts, on China and the United States, and the relationship between China and the United States. Please, Professor Winckler, and the floor is yours.
I have been running around all week talking about American politics in Chinese, and I'm a little confused as to what language I should be in. Columbia has asked me to speak English. 我应该先说几句中国话，就是非常谢谢大家今天来，我很高兴有这个机会到Columbia Global Center来跟你们交换一点意见，关于最近美国的政治的情形，认为是越来越奇怪。So, as many of you know, American politics has not been working very well recently. I don't have to explain that idea. Let me say that I'm really quite interested in the question of what it is the Chinese find puzzling about American politics. John knows and I know that Americans find it very puzzling too. But when we get to the discussion period, if anybody wants to advise me about things that you think need to be explained about American politics, I really would be very interested in what it is that you want to know. So, because time is limited, and this, I really have a rather complicated possible talk, which I will somewhat simplify. Let me start off by defining a political regime as a relationship between politicians, political institutions, and society. And you know, you've probably all heard people talk about regime change, which usually means going from an authoritarian system to a democratic system or in the other direction. Why do I mention this? Well, because a sort of bottom line of my talk, or a question underlying my talk, is America entering what's political scientists call a regime shift? This is a change which is much smaller than a regime change. It's going to certainly remain a democracy, but it might change slightly from one kind of democracy to another kind of democracy. I mean, this happened in around 1800 when we went from a very elite kind of democracy toward mass political parties. It happened around 1930 when we went from a very liberal, market-oriented industrialization process to the New Deal, which had more components of a welfare state. And in a way, the basic question on the table tonight is, are we in the middle of a shift away from the New Deal towards something else? That's certainly what the Republican Party wants to do, and they're working very hard at it. So we have this notion that American politics may not be working very well. In terms of this definition of a regime, politicians, institutions, and society, you can, the simplest thing to do is to blame the politicians. And if they can't, in Congress, if they can't agree, is this working okay? Can you guys hear clearly? Or should I just talk without the microphone? Whatever. Maybe I shouldn't be quite so close to the microphone. What do you think? Okay, very good. So you can blame the politicians. You can say that they're selfish and stupid or something, and that it's their fault. But thank you very much. This is okay. I don't want to blame the politicians. I want to shift the emphasis toward the relationship between the politicians and the institutions and the society. We have a lot of worried political scientists in the United States coming up with analyses of what the problem is. One analysis is that at the moment there's a disconnect between the politicians and the society that they're supposed to represent. In some ways that we will discuss, they don't really represent the views of the American public very well. Another way of putting it is to say that there's a mismatch between the political institutions that America is used to using, the divided powers and all that stuff that you know about, and the current political situation. So they're whooping pig. And I think there's a great deal to that, and so we'll come to that. Now, if the problem is somehow or other in the relationship between the politicians and the institutions and the society, this could be just temporary, or it could be chronic. In other words, something that's going to last a long time, and it will take a long time to fix. And that will come up in my discussion too. Now, the way I would like to approach this is to mention 5 processes that are, as I like to say, transforming American politics, maybe. Now, these processes have very funny names. They're funny names in English, and they're sound even more peculiar in Chinese. But I will just give them to you for your reference. So the first process is polarization, 两极化. I mean, this is obvious. Everybody talks about polarization between the Democrats on the left and the Republicans on the right. But the real problem about polarization is, you know, for most of American political history, the two parties overlapped a great deal. There were a lot of moderates in the Democratic Party and moderates in the Republican Party, and those people in the center could work with each other. But what's been happening in the last maybe 20 years is that those people in the center have been being wiped out. This is particularly true of the elections, the primaries and the elections this year. Many really wonderful public servants in smart Republicans like Richard Lugar were defeated in their primaries because they were challenged by people who were more radical in the sense of being more extreme on the right. So what we end up with is the American public whose distribution of views looks like this, with most people clustered toward the center. The American public is not polarized. It's only the politicians that are polarized. So the politicians look like this, with nobody in the middle, and the people who have survived are further and further to the right, or further and further to the left. So, you know, that gives you a problem of representativeness. In that simple sense, the democracy is not working very well. So how is this possible? Well, I think most of you know that a main mechanism driving this is the primary system, where before the general election, you have a chushuan, where each party selects its nominees. And in those primary elections, most voters don't turn out. Just the committed base, as we say, of the two parties. And those people are mostly either much further to the left or much further to the right than ordinary voters. So they have a great deal of influence on who the candidates are going to be. So the primaries are enough of a problem, but there are a few things that have been going on which have been amplifying the problem, making it even bigger. One of these is our, I go around saying, I don't belong to, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but I'm really upset and disgusted with some things that the Supreme Court, for example, has done. And one of the things they did was to rule that anybody who has a lot of money can use as much money as he wants to in politics, in election campaigns. It's part of a right to speech. Now, anybody who knows anything about American politics for decades has understood that all that money has a terrible influence on American politics, and that you should try to limit the influence of the money. But instead, the Supreme Court declared any of those efforts to limit money unconstitutional and said anybody can use however much money they want. So the result is that a couple of rich right-wing millionaires in Texas can sit there and look at Massachusetts and Illinois and other states and say, there's a moderate there, one of these centrist people that I want to get rid of. And then take huge amounts of money and put it into the election in that other state and use it to defeat the moderate candidate that they don't like. You know, that's a very strange form of democracy, because it ought to be the local people in that state who are choosing the candidate that they want. Another thing that's amplifying this problem is negative advertising. A lot of this money gets spent on television ads which say bad things about the candidates. And that tends to make the public, make the voters in the middle be disgusted with politics and not go to the polls. So if the middle voters don't go, then you only have the more extreme voters. So there are various things that are making this polarization worse. Now, as though that weren't bad enough, just to give you an example, our most recent book on this subject is by two extremely smart and experienced political observers in Washington, Thomas Mann and, oh dear, I can't think of his name, but anyway, the book is called It's Worse Than It Looks. And a while ago, they wrote a book together called The Broken Branch, which was saying that Congress was broken, the broken branch of our government, and needed to be fixed in various ways. But this book, It's Worse Than It Looks, it takes, I think, a rather important step. You know, usually when journalists or scholars comment on a problem like polarization, they try to be fair, which means they say, well, it's the fault of both parties equally, because otherwise they sound prejudiced. In this book, these two guys, who are not Democrats, and they're actually rather, both of them are fairly conservative, and one of them is in a conservative research institute, they said, no, we have to face up to the facts. It's mostly the fault of the Republican Party. Why is that? Well, one reason is that the Republican Party has moved much further to the right than the Democratic Party has moved to the left. Another reason is that, according to them, that the Republican Party is now outside the American. There are all sorts of things like Social Security and health insurance that Americans have come to assume that's part of their government, but that these extremist, increasingly extremist Republicans are against. And the third accusation against the Republicans is that they're as we say in English, they're in denial. They won't admit that there's a climate change problem. You know, they won't admit that there's an environmental protection problem. There are all sorts of difficulties that we face that they just refuse to admit exist. And of course, this has a terribly high cost for the political system because I thank you very much. This is to feed my brain some sugar in the course of my talk. So, thank you. By the way, they have very good jelly beans at the center. Very, very good jelly beans.
Thank you for promoting the center.
Good food also.
Yeah, I'll give a glowing report back to Columbia and New York about the jelly beans. Anyway, the fact that the Republicans won't admit that these things are problems make it very difficult for a Democratic politician to say that they are a problem, because then the voters prefer to listen to the person who says, oh, well, there's no problem, don't worry about anything. So I can't spend any more time on polarization. I'll just mention that it's useful to put polarization in historical perspective. This is the first time that our politics have been very polarized. They were very polarized, for example, before the Civil War. Of course, that's not a very good precedent because then the country fell apart. So we don't want that to happen again. But anyway, there is a historical background to this. Another quick point about polarization is that it's partly, as I have just been explaining, a political process that the politicians are, it's not so much that the politicians are moving as the people in the middle are disappearing. But, and this is important when it comes to the question of how you can fix this, the polarization is also a result of very broad social policies. Migration of Americans from one part of the country to the other, the decline of the industrial Northeast and the rise of the Southwest, various social movements and so forth, which have rearranged the geography of the American population in a way which makes it more and more likely that the two parties will be very separate from each other politically. And, you know, those social processes are not something that you could fix very easily. You can't move the population around. Okay, let me go to a second process, which is a very strange name. I'm going to call it de-electoralization. Now, I don't mean that elections are no longer important. I mean, this year's election is probably going to turn out to be terribly important. But what political scientists mean when they talk about this process is that political conflict has moved significantly from electoral competition to what some people call institutional struggle. Well, let me explain what I mean. In the 19th century, we had two mass parties, and when elections came along, they mobilized all their members and so forth. We had a tremendously high turnout rate, and the parties had a very strong mass base. But by the late 20th century, that mass base was sort of disappearing. The turnout rate in elections was no longer so high. And what the parties did was to try to entrench themselves in various institutions. So, as I'm sure you know from the newspaper, you get a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, and they refuse to cooperate with each other. You get a Democratic president and a Republican House or other chambers, and they refuse to cooperate with each other. I know that if you've read anything about the recent 2 years of the Obama administration, you know about that. But you even have the Senate and the House refusing to cooperate with each other. But this institutional struggle, also goes on in the bureaucracy, in the judiciary. Of course, each party has a right to appoint its people to the bureaucracy and the judiciary, but they're supposed to behave like bureaucrats and judges, not warring political factions. It's now the case that, of course, there are interest groups, but the interest groups are even more politicized than they used to be because the Republicans started insisting that they would only deal with Republican representatives of interests, and so that's more and more partisan. And you know, unlike 30 years ago, each party has its own media system. You know, if you watch Fox News, you hear nothing but Republican propaganda, and if you watch MSNBC, you get nothing but Democratic propaganda. Well, this is, you know, 30 years ago, the networks felt obliged to be, you know, centrist and reasonable and fair and so forth, but that's not what we have now. So this institutional struggle extends to interest groups and the media. And of course, in this institutional struggle, scandals are a very important weapon. You know, think of the Clinton administration and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And the reason this represents a form of de-electoralization, the point is that, I mean, here Clinton was elected as president. He should have a mandate to do things. But the opposite party tried to use scandals to undermine his legitimacy so that he couldn't use the credentials that he got from the election in order to actually do something. And that kind of using scandals to undermine people's electoral legitimacy goes on all the time now. Just one further point about de-electoralization. More and more important decisions have moved out of elected offices, like in the Congress, into things like the Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank or the Supreme Court, which are appointed offices. And of course, one reason that the decisions move there is that there's not so much political conflict in, for example, the Federal Reserve. And that's very lucky because during the recent economic crisis, the Federal Reserve was able to do things that were very important. On the other hand, it's totally undemocratic. It's simply extraordinary that the Federal Reserve makes decisions which are basically our economic policy without any electoral basis for it or consulting anybody. The Federal Reserve Committee just meets and they decide what the interest rate is going to be or whether they're going to give some bunch of companies $1 trillion or whatever else. So again, this is an example of de-electoralization. And of course, the worst one, which I've already on, is our Supreme Court, who are appointed, and of course, this is entirely according to the Constitution. But for example, today, as we speak, everybody in the United States who's interested in politics is waiting to see whether or not the Supreme Court overrules Obama's healthcare reform. I mean, my God, 2 or 3 years ago, virtually nobody in the United States, and certainly not Obama or the Congress that passed it, would have dreamed that the Supreme Court would step forward and, you know, we don't know what they're going to do, but potentially they will just abolish this reform that Obama made, which is supposed to be one of Obama's, you know, major political accomplishments, and it's something he campaigned on. I mean, again, this is an example of de-electoralization. The elected representatives, the president of the Congress, pass a law, and then the unelected Supreme Court comes along and abolishes it. It's going to make a complete mess out of our healthcare system. Okay, let me go to a third process, which I'm giving a very strange name. Again, re-governmentalization. I'll explain that gradually as I go along. So the question is, how is it possible that the Supreme Court can be waging what I would call a counter-revolution, you know, fangirling, against the New Deal? And the answer is that the people on the right, and they have a perfect right to do this, have been working for about 30 years to build up the credibility of right-wing analysis of America's problems. You know, when I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, it was after the New Deal, but the New Deal policies were in place. Everybody assumed that these social welfare ideas and so forth were the correct way to go about governing the country. And most intellectuals and universities were rather liberal in their politics. Well, the Republicans got very sick of this, and so they spent a lot of money and built up things like the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and the Federalist Society in particular, which is their legal arm, coming up with their own counter-revolutionary program for how to abolish the New Deal. And gradually, some of these justices were appointed by Republican presidents to the Supreme Court. And so now we have a counter-revolutionary Supreme Court that was going to contribute to abolishing the New Deal by abolishing Obama's health care reform. Now, why is that re-governmentalization? Well, again, in the interest of time, I'll just say, the thing is that a big, long political struggle like that, building up the institutions, the scholars, the legitimacy, the media outlets, to have an opposite point of view from the New Deal and from liberalism, is not just a change in particular policies. It can also become a change in the whole way that people think about how not only the government should govern, but how they should govern themselves. You've probably heard of something called neoliberalism, which is the opposite of the New Deal liberalism, which is a commitment to the idea that as much as possible things should be run through a market. And it's also a commitment to the idea that as much as possible people should be responsible for their own welfare. So you shouldn't necessarily have Social Security or medical insurance and so forth. People should buy those things in a private market. And then this requires those people to have a certain attitude to themselves, that yes, they should be responsible for themselves and so forth. So I'm actually quoting Foucault, a French political theorist here, because his idea of governmentality is it's a 关于治理的一个想法 mentality, meaning a way of thinking about things. And the Republicans want to carry through a sort of thought revolution to people, to make people change their whole idea about who should be responsible for what government should provide, and what they have to take care of themselves. Okay, let me go on to another process, demobilization. This at least is a genuine English word. I mean, basically what we're talking about here is the decline in electoral participation and in other kinds of political participation by most Americans. This is a very familiar thing for people to complain about. Only half of Americans ever vote in even the national elections, way below what they did in the 19th century. And there are various explanations for this, most of which are at the individual level. They say, well, that has something to do with Americans' attitudes. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But the kind of explanation that I prefer concerns a change in the mix of institutions that make up American civil society. A lot of big terms. So the idea is that you have all heard of Tocqueville in his famous description of America around 1832, and how American politics was very localized, and each community had lots of civic organizations, the fire department, the militia, the people who supported the school, and all sorts of local community activities, and he really quite admired this civic activism. Well, hardly anybody, it's not that people don't do that anymore. People are still quite active in helping their local communities, but the problem is that none of that activity has very much to do with national policy. And this local civil society finds it very difficult to influence policy, even at the state level, let alone the national level. So, if we look at it somewhat historically for a minute, the idea is that, so in the 19th century, when Tocqueville was describing, and for the whole rest of the 19th century, civil society consisted of these mass membership organizations, and the key word here is membership. You belonged to these organizations. You were an active participant. You did. Then in the 1960s, we had a period of social movements, as you know, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and so forth. And that had some effect on undermining these classic membership organizations. And again, by now, we've moved from membership through movements to management organizations. Instead of local civil society being the main form of civil society institutions, they're now all located in Washington, D.C., and they're run by professional managers, elites. There's virtually no membership. I mean, let's say that you are an environmentalist and you want to support the Sierra Club. What do? You write them a check every year to give them money so that they can do their work. Now, this is not necessarily bad, because the Sierra Club and choose your own cause and your own interest group, or as one can say more politely for some of these things, advocacy organizations. Maybe you're advocating that we should do something about climate change, or advocating that we should help starving children in Africa or something. Those organizations in Washington are quite expert, and they're quite effective. So there's really nothing wrong with having that kind of civil society institution. But the problem is that in the 19th century, as I mentioned, we had mass parties. We also had mass membership civil society institutions. And when it came to be election time, the two would form alliances with each other, and that would help bring along the participation of most Americans. Now, you have rather elite parties which don't have a mass base. You have civil society organizations which are these professional management types. And political campaigns are not really party-centered anymore, as the political scientists like to say. They're candidate-centered. So it's to me, it's a rather strange situation. Each candidate, like let's say Obama, looks at various of these interest groups or advocacy organizations and decides which ones he thinks will support him. It's sort of like buying stocks for an investment portfolio. This candidate's portfolio consists of this group of interests, and this candidate's has another portfolio of interests. You know, none of which is a very intimate or permanent relationship. There's no political commitment there. It's just a decision that somebody makes in the course of a political campaign about how they're likely to get the most votes, which of course they need to do. I'll just say one more thing about demobilization, which is that in the 19th century, one of the ways in which the parties competed with each other was that you constantly had new groups of people coming into the electorate. You know, you had new immigrants, you had women getting the vote, you had blacks getting the vote. And the parties could compete to mobilize these new groups. Well, by now, everybody is already participating in the electorate. So there, except for perhaps some recent Hispanic in-migrants from Mexico, there are basically no new groups to mobilize. So now, instead of competing to mobilize as many people as possible in an election, the mobilization is much more selective. I figure out which of you is likely to vote for me, and then I use a computer and telephones and things like that to try to mobilize you. I also figure out who is likely not to vote for me, and at least if I'm the Republican Party, I try to make sure that you don't vote. This is extremely anti-American. You know, you always get lectured in school and on the media that when it's an election, it's your duty, patriotic duty as an American to go vote. But actually, behind the scenes, the parties, particularly the Republican Party, are trying to figure out how to prevent people who might support the Democrats from voting. For example, in Florida, during this election, they have a big campaign to challenge people's credentials. They just go through lists of minority voters and say, well, maybe you're an illegal immigrant or something like that, and you shouldn't have the... It's I think, actually disgraceful, because the whole idea of democracy is everybody should participate as much as possible. But anyway, I'm just calling to your attention a shift in the political strategy that the parties are using, and the fact that this most recent form of competition involves actually deliberately trying to demobilize some of the voters. Okay, one last process, and then I'll move to my conclusion. This last process I'm going to call personalization. Now, a minute ago, I said that I preferred an institutional explanation of demobilization to an individual level attitude or morality explanation. So let me talk for a minute about the individual level. This will be not very polite, but the simplest version of the individual level is just to say, Americans are just a bunch of spoiled brats. They want government services, but they're not willing to pay taxes. They want what they want, but they're not willing to compromise with other people who want something different. So some of the best studies show that most Americans actually think that the politicians should take care of policy matters and not bother the voters with this. They have the strange idea that the best policy ought to be obvious to the politicians, because the people think that it's obvious to them what the best thing to do is. And so the electorate, the ordinary voters, can't understand why the politicians are arguing with each other, since they think that the best policy should be obvious. you would wonder how a democracy could continue to function if that interpretation of the public is true. And part of the answer is that, in a way, it doesn't matter what the voters know or even how they vote. Just the fact that we have elections every 2 years or 4 years, sort of, as we would say in English, keeps the politicians on their toes. You know, it makes them at least try to look like they're doing a good job and try to have some political accomplishments that they can present. But again, that's a rather minimalist form of democracy. Now, a more polite way of phrasing this, some of you may have heard of Robert Putnam, who publishes these books about, his most famous book is called Bowling Alone. The process, we should call this privatization. His interpretation is that Americans don't bother to participate in politics because they're just extremely preoccupied with their private lives. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're selfish. I mean, their families are important and so forth. I personally am not very sympathetic to Putnam's account, partly because I don't believe in political psychology. I'm a political scientist and I'm supposed to analyze institutions. But let me just point out some criticisms of what Putnam's argument. One is, okay, so maybe Americans will come out and join more social clubs and so forth. This is what Putnam measures, you know, whether they participate in joint activities with their friends, go on church picnics and so forth, or go bowling together as a bowling club. Well, I hope that they'll join a bowling club and all go out and have fun, but this is not going to contribute very much to their understanding of national politics, or at least Putnam has not explained how a higher level of social participation, or social capital as everybody likes to call it, is going to improve national politics. Another possibility is that Putnam is too nostalgic for the past. He refuses to recognize that these nationally, professionally managed interest groups and advocacy organizations may be the appropriate form of public participation under current social and technological conditions and so forth. We can't always, it's hopeful, it was 200 years ago, we can't go on behaving like a New England town meeting forever, even though that is very attractive. Another suspicion one has about Putnam, not so much he himself, is he's just hugely popular. Everybody just loves his idea that the problem is privatization. Is that puts the responsibility on individual Americans, you know. You could, the idea is, well, you have to reform the people and their morality, and then you can not bother to think about, well, how should you reform the political system or the policies of the institutions involved. So I find the privatization argument a somewhat easy way out. I'll just mention this idea of personalization very briefly. Another way of looking, particularly at the most recent generation, is actually they're not particularly privatistic. They're very social. You know, they use social media. They're constantly communicating with each other and everything. So I don't think you should view them as too private. It's just that what they're looking for is different from what Putnam has in mind. I would hazard, and I want to be very tentative about this because this is a new way of looking at it, and I'm not an expert on this, and I don't know much about the younger generation. But they're looking for authenticity, you know. They find a lot of politics and what politicians to do to be not very convincing, and so they use their own personal social networks. On the one hand, to look for authentic relationships with other people, and also to establish an authentic identity for themselves, so that they can express their own themselves as persons in their you know, their social media, and also if they participate at all in politics. The problem with this is that, you know, from the point of view of the theory of Republican democracy, you want people who come out and it's called deliberative democracy. You know, as citizens, they communicate with each other about public policy issues and so forth, try to negotiate what they think is a solution to it. These people that I'm describing, this younger generation, really don't do that. When they come out, they're just demonstrating their own sincerity and their point of view. But again, that doesn't, unfortunately, make a big contribution to, a political discussion of what a public policy should be. So let me come to my conclusion. I just want to report to you, 3 different views of this problem. One is that Windy, there's not much of a problem. The second one is Zhongying, Windy. There really is a problem, but there are reforms that we could apply to this problem and possibly solve it. And the third point of view is Windy, so so the first view, which is this, there's not much of a problem. This is not a stupid point of view. Some of our best political scientists have recently argued that actually our political institutions continue to function very well, even when there's divided government and the Democrats control one part and the Republicans control another. We get a lot done. I'm thinking of a scientist at Yale named Mayhew. His most recent book says that people make the argument that I've been making that something about our institutions fails to represent the public property. But his book is called Partisan Balance. And what he tries to show is that over the last 60 years, our democratic representative political institutions have been quite fair to the two parties. Neither party is systematically disadvantaged or kept out of power by something wrong with the institutions. And his argument is that if one party was disadvantaged, they could come roaring out and propose reforms that would solve the problem. And so the very fact that neither party is particularly eager to reform the institutions shows you that that both parties are fairly satisfied with the result. Those are the parties, of course, not the American public. But that point does point to an important fact, which is the parties are critical. If we're talking about reforming American political institutions, if the parties don't want it, it's not going to happen. So the parties of the Zhongying, the critical factor. Okay, another more journalistic version of the Wendy Bada position, the position that there's not really a big problem, is to say, well, look, it's only temporary. Why is there all this fighting? Well, because in 2010, well, in 26 and 28, a whole bunch of Democrats were elected to Congress and other offices, and then 2010, a whole bunch of Republicans were elected, and they still haven't figured out how to get along with each other. They probably won't figure out how to get along with each other, but all we have to do is wait to a future election, which may be this year's election, and then maybe everybody will be a Republican. And then suddenly all these polarization and other problems will go away because there'll be a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, and then the Republicans say, look, we have wonderful institutions, everybody can cooperate with each other. And I mean, I will be terrified if the Republicans take over all the institutions, but they're absolutely correct that that would solve this problem. But I would point out just one thing about that, which is if they do take over all branches of government, then we really are going to have a regime shift, because they're going to continue their attack on the New Deal. They'll try to privatize Social Security and fix all sorts of things which are not really problems until they destroy the institution in question, but that's part of their program. Okay, the second position, which is there's a problem but maybe it's not too bad, and we can fix it. And I'll simply report to you what this book by Mann and Ornstein, It's Worse Than It Looks, say, because they are really smart guys. One of the things they do in the book is to say, look, there are a bunch of reforms that are very popular ideas, but we don't think that they will work. You know, some people want to start a third party. Some people want to impose term limits on politicians so they can only serve a certain length of time. Some people, some people want to pass a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. That's not, they don't think that's going to help anything. They don't think that public financing of elections will solve anything because the private donors can always raise more money than the public financing can provide. And Mann and Ornstein particularly don't want to, as they just wait and hope that things will get better, because they really think that we're entering a crisis and we've got to do something and try to fix this. So what can we do? So some things that they mentioned that might work is, one is that they would like to see less partisan districting. In other words, somebody has to draw the boundaries of the districts from which the politicians are elected. And now it's the politicians who draw those boundaries. And the result is that the boundaries are really often ridiculous. As people like to say, it's not the voters choosing the politicians, it's the politicians choosing which voters they want to have. So if you had more fair, non-partisan partisan redistricting, that might help. You all probably know this problem about the supermajority requirement now in the Senate, that you need more than 50%, you need 60% of the Senate in order to pass anything because of the filibuster. You can't stop debate unless you have at least 60 votes. That's something that the Senate itself could easily fix at the beginning of any Senate term. Of course, then you say, well, why don't they? You know, and then the answer is, well, because actually both parties want to have the filibuster available in case they want to use it. Another reason that nothing gets done about the filibuster is the American public doesn't seem to notice that it's a problem, so they don't particularly care. Mann and Ornstein are not in favor of public financing of elections, but they do believe in more disclosure, because under the Supreme Court ruling, you don't even necessarily have to report who's giving what money to what purpose. And another slightly strange idea that Mann and Ornstein have is you should require all voters to participate in elections. They do that in some countries, and it has a good effect. The main point is that we'll bring out a lot more of the middle voters, but I find it highly unlikely that the parties would pass that, besides which you couldn't require that of party primaries. You could only require it of the general election. Okay, essentially my last point, which is that there's the third view, which is this is a really big problem, and basically we may not be able to fix it. And this analysis requires us to, I won't take the time to actually do it, but we would have to pay more attention to a number of basic characteristics of the American political system, which Americans are so used to that it's hard to believe that they would change it. You know, we have a political commitment to these localized majoritarian elections in which congressmen are selected from territorial districts, and the one person who gets the most votes wins. Well, that's not the only way to organize elections. They don't have to be territorial, and they don't have to be majoritarian, but this particular characteristic is built into our system in a way that creates certain creates certain kinds of problems. We have an economic commitment, a very strong one, to capitalism and private property. that also works back on affecting the political institutions because, you know, like with the business of using private money. So if the problem goes back to some of these basic characteristics that basically we can't change, then it may be really essentially impossible to fix, particularly since the checks and balances system that's creating some of the problems, you know, you could use the checks and balances to prevent any really drastic reform like this, not to mention that most Americans would think that it was un-American not to have localized majoritarian elections and so forth. There's one hopeful exception to this, which is that some of the reforms that I just mentioned, that Mann and Ornstein recommend, have to do with how elections are conducted. And as a political scientist, I'm proud to say that political science believes that if you change electoral institutions, you can have a really big effect on the political system. And all those electoral institutional arrangements are not part of the Constitution, or many aspects of them are not part of the Constitution. So you could change those things if the parties would be willing. My absolutely last word is, so I've made the American political system sound rather Zhongying, you know, that it's in a sort of mess. And I personally think it is in something of a mess. But there's one kind of analysis or approach to this problem which I have left out of this talk deliberately. I have not said that Western democracy as a system just won't work. I don't want you, as Chinese, please don't give up on Western democracy. These problems are specific to a particular form of American democracy, to certain institutions that we've adopted only recently, and to our current political situation. And with any brains or effort, we could fix those problems. And if you just observe our difficulties, when you design your own democratic representative institutions, you can avoid some of these mistakes and do a better job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwin Winckler.
禁止这样。
谢谢，谢谢，非常感谢。I forgot to introduce in our audience there is a well-respected U.S. scholar, Joe Thompson, and from University of California, and he is now the director of the University of California's Education Abroad Program, Beijing Center. 所以呢，他是在北京的代表加州大学集团的，在中国的代表，他的前任我也认识。So and before open to the floor for your questions and answers from you, and let me just give a very brief comment and response to your presentation speech. And I think democracy matters. And so many Chinese, including me, still believe democracy matters. And democracy is vital to social and even individual development. But I believe, and I also think, and other my Chinese colleagues, students believe, and democracy should be realized in various forms and styles. And we just believe in the substance of democracy, and not necessarily, in the United States style and forms. And this is my first point. And the second, tonight I was I was so impressed and inspired by Professor Winckler's speech, you know, and he gave his talk in a very traditional academic scholar way, you know, and he sit here and use his writings, works, and not use the 20th century technology,
yes.
the last century technology, and I still think and this traditional way to conduct research and education, and Professor Thompson, you know, promote University of California's influence and development in China. So, and I still think this traditional way to do our research and to do your education is very, very important. This is my intervention comment. And my third comment is, seemingly to me, and you know, you mentioned the 5 processes, political processes in the United States now, and these 5 processes on 5 trends, and tell us more about the U.S. politics and the current politics, and even the past politics and the future politics for these processes, and. But you know, and you don't mention, you know, the several phenomena, political phenomena. For example, and the Tea Party.
Yes.
The Tea Party, and many Chinese audience, my students, you know, and for example, and asked me, and who are the Tea Party, and who are the supporters of the Tea Party, the voters, you know, and the occupation movement.
Yes.
Occupation movement and occupy not only the Wall Street but also University of California, maybe, I don't know, and also occupy your university, Columbia University, I don't know, and if the university, American university system is part of the Wall Street system, on the Wall Street. Now, the university system also is financialized, already financialized, allied with the Wall Street, or with the finance-related interest groups. I don't know, and but you know, such a political phenomena in the United States, particularly the last since the financial crisis, and well received and well watched in China by Chinese young generations. So, and I would like to listen your comments on the such a political phenomenon, political development, or political part of political processes. And then finally, as I said, and democracy matters, but we are now concerned about how democracy works. And this is your central argument, central point of view, and you know, and the United States, you mentioned the amenity, and a fundamental question. United States also needs political reform. If the political problem, the political challenges, so too big, and too big to succeed, not too big to fail.
That's cute.
Yeah, and if and some Chinese media, some Chinese public websites, and even newspapers, and raise the question, and does the United States need a political reform, or need the political reform? This is, this is our Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, and now advocates this is American political term, advocates China's political reform should be speeded up. And so both countries, the United States, China, United States, now commonly face the task, the tough task of political reform. So, and from my point of view, personally, this is a personalization, also personalization process. From my point of view, I also wanted to listen your views about the comparison of the political reform between China and the United States. And this is my comments. Also for saving time, I would invite Professor Thompson. Do you have some words to say to the audience or to exchange views with Professor?
Yeah, I think, Ed, you might have say something about the national committees, because you talked about the parties, but when you say that, what does it really mean for the DNC and the RNC?
Right.
Their relative power and who's on it, and then these outliers. Yeah, I mentioned the role of the national political parties, and how are they chosen, and who are the players, and how are they connected to the current political people.
Yeah, and you may now respond to our two comments and questions. And before we go to the audience.
Well, very quickly, I don't think I should say too much about Chinese political reform, but I will say that I agree with you that we're in a parallel situation. I mean, I've been raising the idea that America may be facing some sort of regime shift in which things are adjusted. So that puts our two countries in the same condition. You're facing some adjustments and you need reform, and we need some more reform. So I think it's really, I hope we'll have a little more time to exchange views about that. I'm happy to say something briefly about the Tea Party and Occupy, about which I don't know very much, but it was part of my talk. I just left it out for reasons of time. And I would put it under the personalization slot. I mean, you said that your students ask you, who does the Tea Party represent? We have a really good book on that subject by Theda Scotchball and a colleague. She's half of a sociologist and half of a political scientist at Harvard. And she went on to interviewed all sorts of people in the Tea Party to try to understand, as we say in English, where they were coming from, what was their, and I think her basic idea is that they're mostly middle class, older, white, married couples who feel that their version of America is slipping away from them, you know. They want their children to be able to have the same sort of experience of America that they had. Of course, their children may not want to have the same kind of experience, but anyway, that's their attitude. And they're not necessarily very rich. It's just that they feel that some of the things that they worked hard for and so forth they're being given to minorities or to new immigrants or to people who don't speak English or all these undeserving groups. They're deserving because they worked hard and built America according to their version. So that's a if you read the whole book, I think it's a persuasive summary of those. Of course, the Occupy people are their children, much younger group. And so the comment that I was going to make in my talk about both those groups, but particularly about Occupy, is it seems to me that Occupy illustrates this idea of personalization. They're very admirable people. They want to call attention to important issues. They want to stand up and show that they care. But on the other hand, they have very little to say. They identify the problems and show that they're sincere and authentic. And then they assume that somebody else will figure out how to solve the problem. So very briefly, that may be very unfair to the Occupy people. I'm sure that some of the Occupy people, you know, do a lot of work on questions of what policies to do. But, you know, that Occupy formula has spread so quickly over the whole world But it seems to me that it illustrates the idea that to younger people, that's an attractive form of political participation, you know, standing up and expressing yourself. John, I'm going to disappoint you. I don't have too much to say about the committees that run the two parties, except to say that, you know, I mentioned the idea that political scientists emphasize these days that elections are very candidate-centered, you know, and so what's the relationship between Obama and the Democratic National Committee, for example? Well, correct me, but I think the answer is very little relationship, you know. Obama set up his own campaign organization, he raised all his own money, he made all his own strategic decisions and so forth, and the Democratic National Committee, particularly as populated by Clinton New Democrats, was not particularly close to the you know, Obama hope and change message. So, I mean, in a way, and again, correct me if you think otherwise, but the rather weak role at the moment of these national committees illustrates the idea that real political action is migrating to other places. I mean, we could say the same thing about the Republican National Committee. Who is actually running the Republican campaign this year? Well, Karl Rove, who isn't, you know, in office anymore, Bush's former guy, sitting in Texas on huge piles of money, organizing these super PACs and so forth, none of which is happening out of the Republican National Committee, which in the last year or two has had great difficulty choosing a competent person even to run it. So I think that change is part of this regime shifts that I'm trying to, I'm not claiming necessarily that it's happening, but I'm just saying we all need to pay attention to the question of how much of a shift might be going.
Also, thanks. And now, finally, the floor is open to you. Yeah. And try to identify yourself. Your name. Tell us your name.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. And I'm Kelvin Fu. I'm a researcher of China Investment Corporation and the Montreal Institute of International Studies. I appreciate your sharing your insights about the comparison and American democratic process with us tonight. My question is about China. I hope I can get the answers on the basis of your American perception and experience about that. You know, in China, there's only a fraction of the total population to share our political rights. And in other words, the whole system decides that the whole country, the whole political system, in fact, is influenced by some vested interest groups very much. And we admit that some unofficial lobbying system does exist in China now, which is in favor of some special interest groups. And my question is that a good starting point towards the final civil society with the context of your papers and researches, or without further institutional changes, is it possible to reach that?
Thank you. And the second, yeah.
Hi, Professor Winckler. Thank you very much for your speech. I'm a student from Tsinghua University School of Journalism and Communication. Actually, I have two questions for you. The first question is, what elements in American democracy can grow and fit in Chinese culture, and also Chinese people's mentality? And also, what elements in American democracy are applicable in China for maybe like in the next 20 years? And the second question is, what China can contribute to the transformative process in the political life in America?
Wow. Too big.
Thanks. Just share some insights.
And yeah. So.
Thank you, Professor. I'm a sophomore from Peking University, major in mathematics and economy. And I have only one question, and that is, you mentioned 5 trends in American political system, and I'm just curious why these trends are happening. I mean, especially the polarization. I mean, this trend seems to happen for the first time in history. So could you please talk a little about the reason why this are happening?
Thank you, Professor Winckler. I'm a student from Renmin University, which is not far from here. I want to...
The center is located in between Beijing University and Renmin. It's very different. In the middle.
I know to do research work doesn't mean to predict, but I still want to listen to your comments about the opportunity for Barack Obama to be re-elected. I have 2 questions before, but Professor Palm touched both of them. But I still want to re-raise one of them. I think your speech has a very interesting title, American Democracy, Transformative Processes. Do you think such a title can be used to analyze Chinese democracy, if you think there are any? And you may also use the subtitle Transformative Processes, if you like. Thank you very much.
Okay, and let me stop here. First slide. Okay.
Okay, with regard to interest groups, and I mean, I'd love to give a long answer, because I'm personally fond of the idea that comparing China and the United States is useful, and that they actually have much more in common in various ways than you know, some idea that we have the mysterious West and the mysterious East. And there are a lot of institutional similarities between the 2 countries, and one of them is the one that you mentioned, which is both of them have these very powerful economic interest groups. You asked, I think, whether I thought that that was a good start in the direction of civil society, or whether it was, you know, kind of like a dead end, and that those interest groups, I assume you're particularly talking about state corporations, would be perhaps an obstacle to developing a democratic civil society. And I'm afraid I'm inclined to think that it's an obstacle. I mean, it's not clear how you're going to get around those strong economic interest groups unless you, you know, shrink the size of the state sector of the economy and expose more of those people to market forces. But in the meantime, you know, the basic pattern of politics is disappointingly similar, which is that in both Washington and Beijing, you have very strong economic interests going through the back door to say what they want, and nobody can stop them. So our friend from Tsinghua asked what elements of American democracy could work under Chinese culture. You know, I'm very fond of Chinese culture. I had a Chinese wife for a while, and a Chinese mother-in-law and father-in-law, and wonderful Chinese teachers, and I really enjoy being in Beijing and so forth, so I have very high respect for Chinese culture. But as a political scientist, I think it's a bunch of nonsense. Just forget about Chinese culture and design whatever kind of institutions you think you know, will achieve certain purposes, and then the institutions will create the culture that you need in order to make them work. I mean, this idea that you know, you have to have a certain kind of culture in order to create democracy or any other particular thing is, it's got the causal argument backwards. If you look at democratization processes around the world, they They work by putting the institutions in place and then getting everybody to play the game, and then people develop the attitudes which are appropriate to the game. I hope that's an answer. What can China contribute to America? You know, I appreciate that question because I have absolutely no answer, but I'm going to try to think about it. I mean, people keep asking me if I'm talking about foreign policy, whether I think that China and the United States can get along, and are we going to have a war and so forth. I mean, I guess one possibility, I don't think we have to have a war. I think we can get along very well. We face a lot of common problems. So one thing that China could do to help with this possible reform process in the United States is just to be as helpful as possible in jointly solving various problems, not in the United States necessarily, but around the world that we have to solve. I'm sorry, the person who was studying math, what was the question? I can't read my own.
Beijing.
He was studying, he said he was a sophomore studying math. Oh, why are these processes happening now? Well, I would, and you used the magic word history. So I will take the opportunity to mention something I left out of my talk because of time limits. You said, why are they happening now? This is the first time that this has ever happened in American history. But one of my points was, that at least some of these processes, it's not the first time. And the political science analysis that I left out is the following idea. Polarization and some of these other phenomena occur when essentially one issue dominates politics. Before the Civil War, the issue was race, as you know, should we free the slaves or not, and so forth. That was a period of high polarization. At the end of the 19th century, at the height of our industrialization process, the issue was really class. You know, the rich people were getting very rich, and the poor people were starting movements to try to do something about it. That was a very polarized period, but over economic issues. But for most of American history, we've had at least two issues which cross-cut each other: class and race. So if we take this group and we divide it up into two groups where everybody here agrees on every issue and everybody here agrees on every issue, then we have polarization. But if some of you agree with some of these people over here on some issues, then we have the opportunity for a more flexible kind of politics. One reason that the current polarization looks so bad is that the period from about 1930 until about 1990 had very low polarization because we had cross-cutting issues. So what's distinctive about the moment, is that the cross-cutting business has gradually turned around to where what is horrible language, but it's called converging cleavages. We have the situation where you guys are completely against you guys. I hope that's a little bit of an answer. About Obama's re-election, I think that the moment, the best you could say is, realistically, it's a toss-up, 50-50, who knows. We have some very smart people at the New York Times who have a wonderful, complicated model of how to analyze this kind of question. I really admire this person and his predictions. And at 5:38, sorry?
Too close to
Yeah, that's right, too close to call or too close to predict. But according to his model and his prediction, if the election were held today, the likelihood that Obama would win is about 80%. And according to his model, which includes all sorts of complicated factors, 5 months from now, when the election will happen, Obama still has a kind of 60% chance of winning. But that assumes that nothing dramatic happens in between, and all sorts of very dramatic things can happen in between. In particular, the European economy can collapse further, and then the Republicans, and then that will influence our economy, so our unemployment rate will go higher. So then the Republicans can point at Obama and say, see, he doesn't know how to run an economy, which is ridiculous because, what can Obama do about the Europeans? And the Republicans will also say, you see, those Europeans have really made a mess of things. They're a bunch of socialists, and socialism doesn't work, and Obama is a socialist, so the collapse of the European economy proves that you shouldn't re-elect Obama. And I'm afraid that, that the Republicans may be, it's all lies and nonsense, but the Republicans may be able to make those arguments, in which case I wouldn't be very optimistic about Obama therein.
Second one, okay, the final one. Very good question. Identify yourself.
My name is Yang Yanqing. I studied LLM last year, and I'm now a lawyer. I think many people in the United States are saying that Obama is appealing to populism.
Yes.
So I want to know your opinion about what's the role of ordinary people in this process, and whether the politics are more important or less important in American people's life as a whole, in 30 years. Because I think if it's not important, or it becomes less important, why do a lot of work to change? And do you think, as a political contribution, do you think the voters are smart enough or not smart enough so that they wouldn't be influenced by those so-called negative advertisements? And even if they are not smart enough at the first stage, maybe they can vote them out in a second chance. And also, I just want to make an observation that it's said that the Supreme Court might take a Minnesota case to revisit the political contribution case.
Yes.
So I think maybe that's not so important. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Winckler. This is Z. I am a lawyer here in Beijing. And it's more of an observation, but if I understand your argument properly, the idea is that American politics right now there's a crisis, and maybe the crisis is a failure to achieve the right policy outcome. And the reason for the crisis is because of these transformative processes, some of which are also problems, some of which are also problems of the system. I guess the question is a little bit historical. Are we just now faced with too big a problem for democracy to solve efficiently? Or, in the historical context, has it been the case that whenever a really big problem arises, democracy doesn't process it as quickly as we would like, or as neatly as we would like? If you look at the Europeans, they're democratic nations, and they don't seem to be achieving better policy outcomes than the Americans are. So are we now, how important are transformative processes and its uniqueness to the American system, or is it the fact that we have a financial crisis going on, the bigger reason for the challenge that we face to I guess, the legitimacy of democracy, if you want to put it that way?
Other questions? Do you have other questions? Okay.
Well, I'll comment on these.
This is our final round of questions.
Okay. Is Obama a populist? Well, I think he's, in his heart of hearts, he is something of an idealist. There are lots of things that he would like to do, but of course he's also extraordinarily smart, and he realizes that he can't do things that are not politically feasible, if he doesn't have the necessary support. And that's true both domestically and also internationally. So he's become what some people would call a realistic idealist, right? I mean, and I'm afraid that one of his problems at the moment in his campaign is that we all heard the messages of hope and change, but for perfectly and he did a terrifically good job. I mean, he helped pull the country out of the economic crisis. He saved a couple of our big corporations. He ended the Iraq War. He's now in the process of ending the Afghan War. These are all tremendous achievements, and he did it with absolutely no help from the Republicans, who said the minute he came to office that their most important objective was to make sure that he didn't succeed himself, and they didn't care whether they wrecked the economy or the country or what, just make Obama look bad so he cannot be reelected. So I'm not inclined at all to criticize Obama's performance. But the fact remains that it's now difficult for him to give these hopeful speeches, you know, particularly since, as usual, the Republican propaganda machine has, I mean, Romney has been going around saying recently that, well, Obama gives a good speech, but he doesn't know how to run an economy. So poor Obama, every time he gives a good speech, it reminds people of what Romney said, namely that, well, you know, giving good speeches is not really much of a contribution. So that doesn't fully answer all your questions. No, I don't think the voters are smart enough to do anything or to figure out against, you know, negative ads. Otherwise, campaigns wouldn't spend the millions of dollars that they do on that television advertising. And so to this, the second lawyer who asked a question, he summarized in a way, correctly, and in marvelously good English, my talk as saying, well, we have a crisis in the American political system. And I would say yes and no. If you look at it from a progressive point of view, somebody who is hopeful for social democratic, social welfare type policies and so forth, yes, it's a terrible crisis. We can't do anything, and the Republicans are about to come along and wreck the system. But if you're fair and you look at it from the Republican point of view, they think that the New Deal setup is a disaster. They think that it will bankrupt the country. They think that it's their patriotic duty to smash that system. And they're willing to use whatever tactics the American political system provides, in order to achieve that result. So you can tell the opposite story, as I mentioned, which is that if the Republicans win the presidency in the other houses, then no, there won't be any crisis. It's just that it'll be the end of the American welfare state, which was never very strong to begin with. Just one last comment. You brought up the interesting question of decisiveness and effectiveness and Europe. You know, this is also in my talk originally, but so I think many people would, and I think many Chinese perhaps, you tell me, would look at the American system and say, you know, you people can't make up your mind. The policymakers cannot make up their minds. The world has many problems, economic crisis is over to solve. The American political system just is not good enough. Too many checks and balances. You can't. So, you know, in the past, American political scientists have said, well, then what we should do, of course this will never happen, because we could switch to a parliamentary system like they have in England. Then if you have an election, immediately you have a new prime minister, and that prime minister is guaranteed it's not good enough, too many checks and balances, you can. So, you know, in the past, American political scientists have said, well, then what we should do, of course this will never happen, because we could switch to a parliamentary system like they have in England. Then if you have an election, immediately you have a new prime minister, and that prime minister is guaranteed of the support of the parliament, because that's how he's chosen. And then the next day, that government can go to work trying to implement whatever policies it wants to implement. So it's attractive to think that that would be a good idea. But on the other hand, look what the conservatives in Britain did when they won the election. They immediately started an austerity program to reduce government spending and cut government deficits, which plunged the British economy further into recession and may be part of the whole European mess. So as we say in English, be careful what you wish for. You can get a more decisive political system, but the more decisive system may decide the wrong thing. In which case, we're back again with the American founders, whose idea was you should force the political system to make decisions slowly and one piece at a time. And you could use that formula to describe the performance of the American political system in trying to combat the recession, because the Democrats were able to get enough pro-spending, anti-recessionary policies in place that they were some help. And then when the Republicans came along, they were not able to completely get rid of those policies. So in a way, you could make the argument that it makes the American system look good. And my absolutely last comment, I'm telling you, if we get a Republican president and a Republican Congress, I am going to be the first one to use every constitutional obstacle I could possibly use to stop them from doing what they want to do, at which point I will be very happy with the founders' design, to prevent the radical things from happening quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would address the importance of the word, the title, and the keyword is transformation. And 我问你一个问题，你说那个 and transformative in Chinese now and is translated into Chinese as 转型. I don't think 转型 is a good translation of transformation. What is your opinion about transform? The keyword is transform.
改造性的动态，
因为我们中国叫转型，现在转型社会什么什么转型特别多是吧？大学也有转型，社会有转型，我们处在转型时期。但我觉得这个transformative process 这是个一个关键的东西啊。大家看到今天晚上这个讲座，有这个韦埃德教授、韦埃德博士，他们喜欢叫博士，也不喜欢叫教授 ，Professor Dr. Henry Kissinger、Dr. Edwin Winckler。
Mr. is okay too。
所以呢，他们愿意叫，但在中国的话，大概是很愿意叫教授 ，Professor Winckler。因为 Doctor 大概说你比较年轻是吧？你们两个 lawyer 可能就是这样。所以我想的话。The keyword is transformative process, not only the one process, but many processes. One United States, one nation, still one nation, but many processes, political processes. So, and China. Personally, I have learned a lot from your talk, and also from the United States transformative processes. And partly, and your talk, and answer the question, what part of the Chinese about American politics? This is a good question. Also good answers.
Let me just say that I liked the person who said, why don't you give a talk or do an analysis that is Chinese politics, transformative processes. I think that's a great idea, but I'll need a lot of help from my Chinese friends deciding what the important transformative processes in China are.
Okay, and regime change. Regime change is a U.S. foreign policy word, and the regime shift is domestic term, domestic political term. Regime shift. But and in the United States during the years, for example, the Cultural Revolution years, before Kissinger and Nixon's visit, to China in the early years of the 1970s. And the United States called China as the communist regime, and now called DPRK North Korea, and Iraq and Afghanistan also regime, and Cuba and others. And the mainland China called Taipei as regime, and also regime, so authorities, Taiwan 当局. So there are many differences between us, among us, over the understanding and the interpretations on the terms, political and the jungles. So many special terms, and need political scientists like Professor Winckler. Okay, and please join me. I ask you, and join me to thank you, Professor Winckler. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will stay in Beijing. 也是 Chinese 什么三老以前